Today, we're going to begin a new series called The 10 Commandments Through Jesus' Words. The 10 Commandments have long been an important part of our Christian heritage and our Christian faith. I'm sure many of you can remember growing up, seeing them in courthouses, maybe seeing them in schools. In fact, when I was growing up, even in my school, we still had 10 Commandments up throughout the school in various places. Many of you remember maybe the fuss that was made about them several years ago. Many of you were probably challenged like I was to memorize these 10 Commandments, maybe in Sunday schools or vacation Bible schools. Some of you may have a picture of them hanging on your wall at home, or maybe some kind of figurine, maybe of what looks like 2 stone tablets sitting somewhere with 10 Commandments on them, sitting somewhere throughout your house. As Christians, the 10 Commandments are important to us. So we're going to spend a series looking at the 10 Commandments. But throughout this series, we're basically going to look at each commandment, but not primarily from its placement in Exodus chapter 20 or Deuteronomy chapter 5. But rather, we're going to look at what Jesus had to say in relation with these 10 Commandments. Right before Jesus began talking about or touching on many of the 10 Commandments in His Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said this: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Therefore, the 10 Commandments are still relevant for us today. But at the same time, Jesus had a way of always taking everything deeper than most, as He would do throughout the New Testament with many of these 10 Commandments. At times, what Jesus says will line up just about perfectly. It won't be hard to see the comparison between the two. But at other times, Jesus says some things that quite honestly create confusion, as it did for the Pharisees and as it would for the disciples on numerous occasions. So there's going to be times throughout this series where we're going to have to kind of wrestle with the text. We're going to have to try to figure out, okay, the 10 Commandments say this and Jesus is saying this. How does it fit together? The first commandment is the easiest to remember. You all might remember. What is it? Okay, I see a lot of mouths moving. I don't hear many. Maybe we need to memorize the 10 Commandments. I don't know. You shall have no other gods before me. That's the first commandment right there. You shall have no other gods before me. God begins the 10 Commandments with this one. And by doing so, He puts this ultra important commandment at the forefront of our minds. Breaking this one commandment is sure to lead us to break the rest. So God says, you shall have no other gods before me. Literally, no other gods before my face. No other gods besides me. God, our God, is to be the only God of our lives. That's the first expectation. That God is to be our only God. We know that. We've learned that. We understand that. But at the same time, we're all susceptible to breaking this commandment. Oftentimes without even realizing that we've done it. And that's because the temptation to break this commandment is ever present in our lives and often masked or camouflaged in one way or another. As this temptation was even present in the life of Jesus. We read about this in Matthew chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. So turn there with me this morning. The context for this passage is directly after Jesus was baptized. And the Spirit led Him out, drove Him out into the wilderness. And He's going to fast there for 40 days. And we're now at the end of these 40 days. And at the end of the 40 days, Satan comes in. When Christ is at His weakest point, Satan floods in with temptation. He tempted Him first to turn stones into bread. And then he tempted him, took him to the highest point of the temple and said, okay, throw yourself down right here. Basically, commit suicide right here on the ground. Bring yourself back to life. And then here, Satan gives his third and final temptation to Jesus. And in verse 8, we'll begin. It says, again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I'll give you, he said, if you'll bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve Him only. In this passage, Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, specifically verse 13. And by doing so, in the face of temptation to serve and bow down to Satan, Jesus reminds us of the first commandment. Worship the Lord your God and serve Him only. And though it's not a specific quote of the first commandment, it still has that first commandment overtone throughout it, as we are called to serve God alone. We are to worship and bow down to God alone. You shall have no other gods before me. After all, God alone is worthy of our worship. There's no one who is worthy of such worship. There's nothing that is worthy of such worship. No God that has ever been thought up in people's minds, no person who has ever walked this earth has been worthy of the worship that our God deserves. Buddha is not worthy of such worship. Allah is not worthy of such worship. Brahman, the Hindu god, is not worthy of such worship. None of the Greek gods that we can read about through Greek mythology or whatever are worthy of such worship. No emperor, no celebrity, no leader, no ideology, no god or goddesses, and no person in this world that might come to our minds is worthy of our worship. God alone, our God, Yahweh, is worthy of our worship. And here's why. What or who we worship begins with proper recognition. If we are going to worship anything or anyone, we should properly recognize why they are being worshiped. If we are to take a look at who God is, what God has done, the context surrounding God and His Scriptures, we can easily see that God is the only one worthy of our worship. In Jesus' response to Satan in verse 10, again, He quotes Deuteronomy 6:13. And before God tells Moses in Deuteronomy to fear the Lord your God and serve Him only, He spends the previous 3 verses talking about what He did for the Israelites. That's Deuteronomy 6:10 through 12. Talks about what He did for the Israelites. He talks about the land that He gave them, the houses they didn't build, with the goods that they didn't provide, about the wells that they didn't dig, the vineyards and the olive groves that they didn't plant. And then right before He says to fear God and serve Him only, God says this: be careful that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. God sets up proper recognition of what He did. He'll do it again with both places where the 10 Commandments are found. Exodus 20 verses 1 and 2, right before going into the 10 Commandments, God says this, and it says, verse 1, and God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, check this, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And then on to Deuteronomy 5 verse 6. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. God says, I'm the one who gave you your freedom. I'm the one who gave you this land. I'm the one who's done all this stuff for you. Not these foreign gods that you all are even contemplating worshiping right now. Not that statue, not that shrine that someone has made, not that figment of anyone's imagination. It was me, so worship me only. In each spot, and that we see the idea of worshiping God only, we see the preceding verses setting up what God has done, and that God has led the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery. And I believe this serves as a foreshadowing for what God would do centuries later for the work of Christ on the cross. You hear foreshadowing, you see foreshadowing in movies. Movies and TV shows will often do something towards the beginning that kind of paves way for you to figure out what's going to happen in the end. The one that pops up into my mind, it's one of the first, I have to be careful, you Star Wars fans, how I say this. Episode 1 or 2, it's one of those two, I can't remember which one it is, but Anakin is like standing out here in the desert, right, and there's this house or rock, I ain't watched it also, but there's this rock, and he's like a kid, and there's a shadow that's portrayed upon the rock in front of him. And if it was me here, it should be my shadow, but what it showed was not his shadow, but the shadow of Darth Vader. I'm blowing your all's minds right now. Anakin Skywalker becomes, it is Anakin, isn't it? Is that right? Yeah. I had 3 sisters growing up, did not watch Star Wars. But Anakin shows the shadow of Darth Vader. It's a foreshadowing that shows, hey, this guy is going to become him. You see it throughout all kinds of movies, little clues here and there. Apparently the beginning scene of The Wizard of Oz is decorated with foreshadowing as to what's going to happen throughout. Go back and watch it, you'll find out. They'll drop little clues, again, here and there for what's going to happen later on. If we watch closely, what might seem as an isolated moment or an isolated quote or isolated event ends up pointing forward to the ending. And I believe that the same is true of the Exodus. I believe the exodus of the Israelites out of bondage, out of slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Holy Land serves as a foreshadowing for what Christ is going to do on the cross. And while the Israelites received earthly freedom, the freedom Christ gave and still gives today is much deeper than that as we are led out of bondage of sin today. With the Israelites, God gave them freedom from the Egyptians, but today He gives us a much deeper freedom. And that is, He leads us out of that bondage, out of that land of slavery to sin. If we're going to look at why we worship God, that's where we start. We can look at and should look at His provision. We can and we should look at His sovereignty. We can and we should look at His blessings, His holiness, His righteousness, the fact that He is just in all of His ways and that God alone is truth. But most importantly, God is love, and that love is what freed us from the greatest bondage and enslavement that any human has ever encountered. That love is what has freed us from our bondage to sin. It's what ripped the shackles from our feet, from our arms, and truly set us free. God brought us out of the house of slavery to sin. Show me another God who's done that. Show me another person, another human who has done that. There's not one. There'll never be one. Because there can't be another. Only God, our Lord and our God, has set us free. A proper recognition of that, of what God has done for our souls, for our eternal souls, will prove that God alone is worthy of our worship, that no one and no thing deserves even a moment of worship in our lives, but that God deserves it all. However, with that said, the temptation to worship something or someone's always going to be there. And that's because Satan's ultimate goal is to make us like him. And to do that by causing us to worship anything or anyone other than our God. That's what he did with Jesus. He tempted Jesus, said, hey, bow down to me. And Satan, a fallen angel, said, bow down to me, Christ. Many see this kind of as a final desperate move for Satan. He's tried to say, turn rock into bread. Hey, throw yourself down from this temple. Okay, if I can't get you to do those, I'll go for this desperate kind of last move here, desperate move. Bow down to me. It's desperate because Jesus is God in the flesh. But here's what it shows us. If Satan is going to tempt Jesus to worship Him, if Satan is going to tempt Christ, God in the flesh, to worship Him, how much more is he going to tempt us today? If he's going to tempt God's only Son to worship Him, how much more do you think he's going to tempt you today? You see, while it may be a desperate move for Satan to tempt Jesus to bow down to Himself, it's not desperate for Satan to tempt us to bow down to Him. Because we're born with this innate desire to worship something or someone, and Satan knows that. So Satan tempts us each and every day. Bow down to me. Bow down to me. What was the ultimate temptation that the devil used on Jesus? Let's look at it a little more closely. Satan took Jesus to this very high mountain. He showed Him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. When I went to Israel, I think it was around the area of Jericho, we actually looked at this mountain, and he said, this mountain right here is supposed to be where Satan took Jesus and showed Him the kingdoms of the world and all their splendor, right there on that mountain. It was pretty cool. But scholars suggest that maybe it wasn't just that incident alone, but maybe it was a vision. If they would have went to that mountain, they'd been able to see quite a bit because it was really flat down there below it. But scholars think, okay, if it's going to show all the kingdoms, maybe it's a vision. It doesn't matter if it was just a few kingdoms out here, and he said this depicts all the kingdoms, or if it was a full-on vision. Regardless of it, the root of the temptation is the same. He's being tempted now with power and with splendor. He says, hey, you can come here, you can get all these earthly kingdoms, you can take all of their splendor if you'll just bow down to me. Earthly power, earthly splendor. In essence, bow down to Satan and you can have it all. Bow down to anything. Satan's going to craft it in such a way that it's not so much bow down to me, but bow down to anything other than God. And you'll serve yourself and gain what you've always wanted. That's the temptation we see right here. And how often is that the temptation today? I believe we're tempted each and every day in this exact regard. We may not be promised all the kingdoms of the world and all of their splendor, but Satan is tempting us with small doses each and every day. He doesn't have to tempt us with the whole, all the kingdoms and all of their splendor, because let's be honest, we'll go after just a small touch of it. Just give us a small glimpse of that, and we'll kind of go after it. So Satan tempts us with small doses each and every day, and he's saying, sell out just for a moment. Hey, you'll gain an in with your boss. You'll get that power. Sell out just for a moment. You'll gain an in with your neighbors or your friends or whoever. Sell out just for a moment. You'll get an in with your professor. Sell out just for a moment, and you'll gain an in, or you'll gain all these objects that you've ever wanted. You deserve them. You've worked for them. Sell out. Sell out just for a moment. You'll get that raise. You'll get that promotion. You'll take in all this money. You'll reach some guy or some gal or some goal you've made in life if you'll just sell out for one moment. He tempts us with power, whether that be at work or at home or in the church or wherever. And He tempts us daily with splendor, whether that's wealth of some sort or clothes or houses, phones, computers, business, money, whatever. Basically, His temptation is to sell out, even if just for a moment, and to enjoy yourself now while you can. And you know, the craftiness of Satan, with the craftiness of Satan, the temptation to enjoy ourselves doesn't even have to look like we're selling out. Temptation can be formed in such a way that it makes it look like we're still true to God while serving self through the worship of someone or something else. Let me give you a couple examples this morning. None of these things in and of themselves are necessarily terrible things, depending upon the context of their importance and their priority with God in our lives. So I want you to be honest, open with yourself this morning. Maybe you should say a quick prayer. God, open my heart so that if any of these or anything like them is my situation. God, that I might repent and realize that and worship You alone. Let's begin. Satan tempts us. This is Wildcat country, right? Basketball. I'm going to press your toes right now. Satan tempts us to follow a sports team through and through to the degree that we can name you all kinds of players, all kinds of coaches, all kinds of statistics. And we can tell you everything that's happening at the drop of a hat, but we struggle to remember, even care about what God said and did in His Scriptures. That is worshiping something other than our God. He can tempt us right now to kind of keep up with the Kardashians or whoever's on there on some Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, whatever celebrity news, to the point that we care more about what the family, that family or whoever's family is doing than we care about the family of God and what the family of God is called to do and is doing right now. With the presidential race that is coming up, Satan's quick to use this to get us to worship anything and everything else in this world, to get worked up over what one of the candidates' views is opposed to another. And while I think it's good to stay well informed so we can know how we should vote in the upcoming election, we cross the line of near or straight out worship when we can tell someone else more about what a candidate believes about a certain topic than we can tell them about what God believes about a certain topic. Pokemon Go right now, it's the rage of the world, and we go out to the streets and find all these Pokemon. It says, hey, you got to catch them all. It's Pokemon Go, so you have to go. But when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission to go, how worried are we about it, church? We don't walk the streets and go out there and catch the fish that Christ told us to go out there and catch. We decide it's best, let's just sit at home, twiddle our thumbs, and watch the news and pout about everything that's happening. Satan makes those rewards that we get, MVP rewards, Employee of the Month award, whatever you may have, it seem like they're worth having because we need to get credit where credit is due. So we work hard for these treasures that hang on a wall and sit on a table, but we don't consider the importance of storing up treasures in heaven. We could go on for days and for days and for days about the stuff, the meaningless stuff that we worship here on this earth. That Satan says, hey, you're not selling out right now. You're just enjoying yourself. Let me tell you, church, that's the biggest temptation Satan's going to give you in this world. You sell out just for a moment. Enjoy the Wildcats. Enjoy the presidential race. Enjoy whatever it is and forget about God. That's the biggest temptation we face, and that is when we stop worshiping God and we start worshiping self. We are called to worship God. Worship God alone. You shall have no other gods before me. Not the Wildcats, in my case, not the Volunteers. It's not Trump and it's not Clinton. It's not some game that's on or some gadget that we have. Worship God and worship God alone. The point is, Satan crafts temptations to worship anything or anyone other than God in ways that sometimes are hard to see. We'll give credit where credit is due. Satan is crafty. He is the father. He's a liar. He is the father of lies. He presses on certain buttons. He flips certain triggers in an attempt to push us away from God and towards self. Away from God and towards Satan. And while it may not look exactly like Satan, it may not have the red face and the outfit with the little horns, it's disguised in one way or another. Satan's trying to get us away from God and toward anything and anyone this old world has to offer. And he's willing to do anything and everything to reach this end. So again this morning, let's begin with proper recognition. If we're going to worship something, we need to have proper recognition. Satan offers the kingdoms of the world power here on earth. Even if we were given power here, guess what? It's only fleeting. It lasts for just so long and then it's gone. We just did a time series. We ain't here for very long. The power He can give is only a short amount of time. But God gives us a power that goes on to the next life. What's that mean? God wins. Satan offers us the splendor of the world, gadgets and toys and gores and games galore. But these items are fleeting, here and gone tomorrow. We either have them for a while, they break down, or they get out of date, or we die and we can't use them any longer. But what God promises is that we can store up treasures in heaven, treasures that will last. God wins. Satan offers us joy and peace and confidence and hope through sports teams and celebrities and politicians and even our family members, whoever. But how many times have these people disappointed us and let us down? Joy and peace and confidence and hope in sports teams and celebrities and politicians can be shattered in an instant. But God gives us a hope and a joy and a confidence and a peace that is unexplainable, that lasts even through loss, that lasts even beyond death. God wins. Satan offers us this world. God offers us the next. God wins. Ultimately, here's the deal. In every single category we can ever think about on this earth, God wins. Because Satan can only give us things that are temporary. But what God offers is eternal. The things of this earth, whether people or jobs or hobbies or self or work, aren't worthy of our worship. No God that is made up or nothing that we can make a God out of is worthy of our worship. For God is the only one. God alone is worthy of our worship. So when Satan tempts us to serve him through serving self and any of those things I mentioned earlier or anything that I didn't mention, just as Jesus did, our response is to be the same. Away from me, Satan. For it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve Him only. This morning we may be worshiping someone or something and not even realize it. I think it'd be a good idea if we do very well if we would ask God to reveal to us who is the honest recipient of our worship. Who am I worshiping? Maybe we need to ask God, God, am I worshiping You, or am I worshiping the Wildcats? Am I worshiping You, or am I worshiping my job? Am I worshiping You, or am I worshiping wealth and goods that will not last? Am I worshiping You, or am I worshiping some game? God, am I worshiping You, or am I worshiping self? And we could even stop with the first line. God, am I worshiping You? Because if there's conviction there, if there's any doubt in our minds there, then there's some repentance that needs to take place. If there's any doubt in our mind there, then there's some turning. There's some reevaluating of our lives that needs to take place there. We do well to ask God this morning, open our eyes that we might see what You see. But most of all, we do well this morning to make a commitment today that, God, I'm going to worship You and worship You only. That when I wake up each day, God, You're at the forefront of my mind, the forefront of my thoughts and my heart. And every day, choose to live for Him. This morning, if God shows you that you're worshiping something or someone else that is not Him, then I pray you'll repent and that you'll begin giving praise where praise is due. If you haven't made the commitment to serve God, then I pray you'll make that commitment. If God is calling you to serve Him in some capacity, specific capacity, to make that your way of worshiping Him, then I pray that you'll worship Him, make that commitment today. Whatever it might be, whatever God is calling you to do, to turn your worship and your praise upon Him. Let us be a people who resist the temptation of Satan, and who each and every day when we wake up, choose God. Let us be a church that worships God alone. For God alone is worthy of our worship. Father God, it's sometimes hard for us to see or remember. We're forgetful people. It didn't take your people long to forget who it was that led them out of the land of slavery. It's easy for us to be tempted by the things of this earth. But God, redirect our worship and our praise to You. Lord, everything that we do, if it's watching a basketball game, if it's going out and catching them all, doing whatever, God, I pray that in some way, even through that, we'll find a way to worship You. We'll find a way to make our lives a life of worship. Now, the things of this earth that, to be honest, if we die today, they're not going to matter. They're going to be stuck here with us, with the people that we leave behind. God, they're not worthy of worship. Our jobs, not worthy of worship. Our hobbies, not worthy of worship. God, You alone. Give us proper recognition. Remind us daily, God, that it was You who led us out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Specifically out of the slavery to sin. God, let us worship You alone. It's in Your Son's name I pray. Amen.